Hello, good morning, good afternoon, depending where you are. We'll just give it another moment as people are filing in from the waiting room. Welcome to today's ARC Talks webinar, which is on ATTR clinical trials. Delighted that we have Kristen Hsu, who is our Executive Director of Research here at ARC, who is a mine of information and will be presenting about the current clinical trials. Just a little background about who we are. We're the Amyloidosis Research Consortium. I'm Isabel Lusada, I'm the CEO, and our mission is to improve and extend the lives of those with amyloidosis. We work in four main areas, which is improving the speed and accuracy of diagnosis. Many of you will have experienced delays before getting a diagnosis, and it's critically important to get diagnosed early if possible. And then we have two scientific research areas that Kristen leads on, which is increasing our understanding of the genetics and biology, the science behind amyloidosis and our understanding of that, in order to identify new treatments. And then accelerating the research so that we can get drugs approved faster and also reimbursed and into the marketplace for patients to be able to access them as treatments. And lastly, and this is where ARC Talks falls into, enhancing care and quality of life for patients and caregivers throughout their amyloidosis journey. So we have a comprehensive group of programs that really provide educational and support for patients. Next slide. I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsors for today. Thank you. Next slide. Just before we begin, the webinar is recorded and we'll post the webinar, the link to it on our website so you can view it again later. You'll see at the bottom there's a Q&A box. So at any point that you have questions, post them into there. We will have time at the end of the presentation in which to answer those questions. Keep them, if you can, to questions around the clinical trials. We will not answer in this call personal questions or disease-specific questions. If you're having trouble with the audio, and you can use your, on your computer, you can dial in. So check in the email invitation, there's information about how to access through the phone the audio. Just a quick note, we have a series of booklets. If you hold a mobile phone up or you write in ARCI to the QR code, it will, and press the photo icon, it will capture that site. You can also find it at archi.org/booklets. And there are a number of disease-specific booklets on ATTR. So with that said, I'm delighted to hand over to Kristen to start today's talk.
All right. Hi, everyone. As Isabel said, my name is Kristen Hsu, and I am the Executive Director of Research here at ARC. I've been with ARC for over 9 years now. Prior to joining ARC, my background is actually in clinical trials, so designing, executing, closing out clinical trials for large indications like Alzheimer's disease to some really small, rare and ultra rare studies in both pediatric and adult populations. So I'm excited today to share some updates on some of the clinical trials that are going on in TTR amyloidosis currently. I'll cover a little bit about what causes TTR amyloidosis and the different treatment mechanisms that are being studied, but most of the discussion is really going to focus on the clinical trials themselves. If you're newly diagnosed and just starting to learn about the disease, this might be a lot to take in. As Isabel mentioned, we've got our booklets available and some really good resources on our website. So I would encourage you to start there and maybe refer back to this after you've got like a good foundation and can build from there. Please feel free to take screenshots. We will be sharing the slides and the presentation thereafter, but make sure you're more than welcome to share anything you like with your doctor, to ask questions and discuss in more detail. We'll put this on the website so you'll have access to the content and can refer back to it whenever you need. I do update these presentations every 6 months, so we'll be planning to do another TTR talk in July to go over the new updates that are taking place. So my last reminder will be that today's content is going to focus on TTR amyloidosis trials. If you have AL amyloidosis, I'm not going to cover that today. You can find a similar talk I did back in November on our website. You can either look at the webinars, and it should be like the second to the top one on the panel, or you can go to our YouTube page and access the AL talk from November there. I'll do the next AL amyloidosis clinical trials talk in April of this coming year and every 6 months thereafter. All right. If you've joined these calls before, you know that I typically start by going over the basics of clinical trials, kind of clinical trials 101. I've included information on the slides that will be posted, but I want to make sure we have enough time to cover the trials themselves. And so the most important piece that I want people to take away from today's call is just that I'm going to focus on interventional clinical trials of novel or targeted therapeutics. And in this case specifically, trials that are evaluating whether investigative drugs are safe and effective for patients. There's a lot of information about what the different phases of clinical trials are, what are the different types of assessments or tests, procedures that might be done, how to think about risk versus benefit, why to participate in clinical trials. That will be available in the slides on the website. And you can feel free to ask questions about it, but I want to make sure we get kind of to the heart of the matter, and so won't be covering that directly here today. But I will be focusing, as I said, primarily all of the studies that I'm going to be covering actually are phase 3 studies. So these are the phase of study that happens typically before a drug would get approved. And so it's confirming how well treatments work, monitoring side effects, and comparing these new treatments with either this current standard of care or a controlled arm in a controlled study. And so those are going to be all of the studies that I actually cover today in the TTR space. All right. So before we just dive into specific trials, I want to first make sure that we all have a common understanding of how TTR amyloidosis, what causes people to get TTR amyloidosis, how it happens, so that we can then dive into like how it's being studied to treat. And so we'll start with the disease. So how the disease works. This is covered in a lot of detail in the booklets that Isabel mentioned that you can download. I'm just going to cover the basics to help us make sense of the treatments themselves. So TTR amyloidosis, ATTR, starts with the protein transthyretin, which is also called TTR. I'm going to call it TTR for this presentation. We all have and make TTR in our bodies, and it's intended to transport thyroxine, which is a thyroid hormone, and retinol, which is vitamin A, throughout the body. Most of our TTR is produced in the liver, though there are small bits that are also made in the choroid plexus of the brain and in the retina. Now, in its native state, how it naturally exists, it's typically made up of subunits. And so those are these like 4 different parts that you can see in the different colors on the slides, typically made up of subunits that combine into this tetramer. In TTR amyloidosis, in TTR patients, the TTR tetramer becomes unstable, either caused by a genetic mutation, if you have hereditary or variant TTR amyloidosis, or for age-related reasons in the wild type. The TTR tetramer becomes unstable and dissociates into 4 different subunits known as monomers. Monomers then misfold and aggregate into amyloid fibrils, depositing in the organs like the heart, the nerves, the GI tract, causing damage. If you have amyloid fibrils in your peripheral nerves, it's known as TRITON-PN. If you have it in your heart, it's known as attr-cm. So those are the 2 main types. And that's what most drugs are typically either investigating, attr-pn or attr-cm. And you'll see that on these slides. So if that's how TTR amyloidosis, how it works, how do you treat it? So I am going to ask you to think of TTR amyloidosis like a bathtub slowly filling with water. So in this analogy, the bathtub represents your heart, your nerves, your other organs. The water dripping from the faucet represents the TTR protein. In TTR amyloidosis, this protein is made normally at first, but as I mentioned, it dissociates, it misfolds, clumps together, and forms amyloid deposits that build up in your organs. You start with an empty bathtub, which is your healthy organs. Over time, the faucet keeps dripping. And as more and more TTR protein is produced, more of it misfolds and turns into amyloid. Gradually, the tub fills up just as the amyloid slowly accumulates in the body and begins to interfere with how your organs are working. Now, there are a couple of ways to address a filling bathtub. One option is to turn down or turn off the faucet. In medical terms, this means slowing down or stopping the production of the TTR protein. When less TTR is being made, there's less protein available to misfold, so new amyloid buildup slows or stops and the organ function might stabilize. However, if you turn off the faucet, you can see on the right, the tub is still full. You need to deal with the amyloid that has already built up. In order to deal with the amyloid that's already built up, you would also need to drain the bathtub, which represents clearing existing amyloid from the organs or depleting it. Ideally, treatment does both. It would both turn down the faucet to prevent new amyloid from forming, and it would help drain the tub by removing amyloid that's already there. So together, those two different approaches aim to protect organs now and reduce further damage over time. And so bringing this back to TTR amyloidosis itself, let's look at the different treatment approaches that are being studied in TTR amyloidosis. And so we'll start with the treatments that would potentially turn off the faucet or slow down the production of new TTR and therefore have it not be available to misfold and fill the tub. And so these treatments are generally classified into two different categories. You have your knockdown agents for TTR. So these are designed to inhibit the production of the TTR protein in the liver, thereby reducing the level of TTR in the body, preventing the amyloid from building up. And so you can see on the left here, the ones that are listed in blue, or I guess black, depending on the screen color. These are actually products that are currently approved for one type of TTR amyloidosis. Most of these drugs were initially studied in TTR polyneuropathy and are approved in TTR polyneuropathy, like patisiran, inotersen, vutrisiran, eplontersen, and in some cases are now also being studied for treatment in TTR cardiomyopathy. And so a good example of one that is both approved and investigational would be eplontersen. And you can see that with that little red star here. It's approved currently for the treatment for hereditary TTR with polyneuropathy, but it is currently being studied in clinical trials to assess whether it's an appropriate effective therapy in TTR cardiomyopathy as well. These first four are all known as gene silencers. So these are drugs, again, that stop the production of TTR, the TTR protein. And then the next two categories, or the next two drugs, there's Nexiguran, Ziclumeran. I don't usually say that. I'm just going to call it Nexz. So this is a CRISPR-Cas9 gene editor. We'll talk about this in a little bit. And then nucresiran is a follow-on gene silencer similar to patisiran and vutrisiran, but offers a different dosing schedule, which I'll describe later. We also have our TTR stabilizers. So these would include tafamidis or Vyndamax for those of you who are currently being treated for TTR cardiomyopathy with it. Acoramidis, which is, or Attruby, which is approved for the treatment of TTR cardiomyopathy, but is being studied for the ability to prevent or delay onset of hereditary TTR amyloidosis in known gene carriers. So we'll discuss that later. And then there are some products, diflunisal and tolcapone, which are also have TTR stabilization properties, but they are not so they are approved in other indications. They are not currently being studied in active trials for TTR amyloidosis in the US, but there are stabilization properties, and we know that patients have quite a bit of experience with diflunisal, at least in the US historically, using it as a TTR stabilizer. And then the last category of treatments are our anti-fibril agents or our depleters. These are the drugs or the treatments that would empty the bathtub. So the ones that would remove the existing amyloid that has built up in the organs. And so we've got investigational products that are currently being studied to evaluate whether they are effective at removing amyloid and improving outcomes in patients for TTR amyloidosis. And I'll discuss both of these later on. All right, so for the remainder of the time, I'm going to go over some of the key interventional trials that are currently taking place in TTR amyloidosis. I'm not going to review every trial, but we'll focus on the trials for novel therapies for TTR. And I'm going to start with one, just highlighting what's changed since the last time I did this talk. If you attended in July and just kind of want to know what's happened since then, we'll start there. I'll then cover 4 trials that are recruiting currently for TTR amyloidosis, and we'll then close with some of the upcoming milestones, things to just keep an eye on. Not recruiting right now, but either data that's reading out or changes that could be announced over the calendar year 2026. All right. So this slide I'm going to come back to a few times. As I mentioned, we'll start with just kind of new developments, then move to recruiting trials, and then focus on upcoming milestones. And so these 4 studies that I have highlighted in red are essentially what's changed since the last time we reviewed these in July. And so we're going to cover each of these in detail in later slides, but just to give you the high level, here's what's happened. Alnylam has initiated a phase 3 study of nucresiran in TTR polyneuropathy. So this is a gene silencer, twice a year, new phase 3 study. This is actually a great option for hereditary TTR polyneuropathy patients in the US, as it's the first interventional trial with an investigative therapy that's been treating for this population, recruiting in the US for several years now. So we'll cover that in more detail. There are 2 phase 3 studies for NextZ, which I won't try to pronounce again. This is the gene editor CRISPR-Cas9. These studies have been ongoing for some time, but are currently on hold. We'll talk about that later and what to look out for in the coming months. And then the phase 3 study for Cliramitug, which is a anti-fibril agent, a depleter, drain the bathtub product, if you will, has initiated. So this is their phase 3 study in TTR cardiomyopathy. This is a large study, and so we'll cover that study in greater detail. The only other thing I'll mention, I don't have it on this slide because I really want to just focus on what's going to be happening over the next calendar year. But BridgeBio did recently also announce that they are working to develop another depleter product. So another one that a product that would similarly drain the bathtub and remove the amyloid. They're projecting it won't enter clinical trials until 2027, 2028. So we've got some time until it reaches the clinic, but it is another potential depleter coming to clinical trials in the future, which is a great sign. So. All right, so now let's focus on the trials that are currently recruiting patients, specifically these 4 that are highlighted in red. So we've got the acoramidis study for TTR carriers, known TTR carriers, 2 studies of nucresiran, 1 in cardiomyopathy, 1 in polyneuropathy, and then the phase 3 study of Cliramitug, which I mentioned earlier. We'll talk through each of these in detail. And so let's go to the next slide. All right, so acoramidis, the ACT early study, it's an interesting study to start with as part of this presentation, just because it's actually a study for individuals who don't have TTR amyloidosis by definition yet. And so it's a study for individuals who have a confirmed TTR genetic mutation. So they've got a known TTR or genetic mutation, but they haven't actually developed the amyloidosis yet. So they don't have the associated cardiomyopathy or polyneuropathy that you would need in order to be diagnosed with active disease. And so this is a large phase 3 study evaluating whether treatment with acoramidis, which is a stabilizer, so one that is going to turn off the faucet, it's going to inhibit it's going to stop the production of new amyloid by keeping the TTR molecule stable so that it's not dissociating and forming these different subunits. This is going to study whether treatment with acoramidis can prevent or delay the development of disease in participants who have a confirmed gene mutation, so like V122I, V30M, T60ALA, but who have not yet developed any symptoms of the disease. This is going to be evaluated by measuring how long it takes these individuals to develop active disease, either polyneuropathy or cardiomyopathy. We would hope that treatment with acoramidis would prevent somebody from getting the disease by keeping that TTR molecule stable and preventing the production of amyloid. And it might delay how soon, either prevent them from getting it entirely or delay how soon somebody might get it. And so the study is going to evaluate whether participants develop either TTR, when participants develop either TTR cardiomyopathy, which would be picked up through biopsy or imaging, or whether they develop, when they develop TTR polyneuropathy, either through the development of new signs and symptoms or a biopsy. And so who qualifies for this clinical trial? Now, each of the studies that I review have dozens of different, very specific criteria that participants would need to meet in order to be eligible or qualified to enroll. And those all need to be assessed by one of the clinical center study doctors. And so I only plan on highlighting some of the key criteria for each study, things that patients might commonly be able to recognize in themselves and prompt them to seek consult with their physician and really identify, is this a good study for me? Would I be a good candidate? The most important criteria for this study is that participants be between 18 and 75 years old, have an inherited TTR genetic variant that puts them at risk for developing TTR amyloidosis, and are within 10 years or older of the typical age when symptoms of hereditary TTR amyloid disease are expected to develop. And so the question then is, what is that typical age? There is data that suggests that most gene carriers who develop the disease will develop it around the age of a family member who passed the mutation on to them. It's not exact, and so the study will recruit individuals who are within 10 years of that family member's age or older. And then in the case where family history might not be known, which we know that is the case for many, then the predicted age of onset will be based off of published literature. And so an example for this, the predicted age of onset, so for a given individual, might be around 50 years old, for a given individual might be 50, either based off of their family history or the literature. The age of the participant must be between 40 and 75 years in order to qualify for the study. So if your parent developed the disease at 50, and you are a 30-year-old genetic carrier, you will likely not qualify for this study. If your parent developed the disease at 50 and you're in your 40s, you might be a good candidate for this study. And so that's something to speak about with your physician. Now, participants who do qualify and enroll in the study are going to be randomly assigned by chance to receive either acoramidis or placebo. Each participant will have a 1 in 2 or a 50-50 chance of being assigned to acoramidis, or a 1 in 2 50-50 chance of being assigned to placebo. Both will be given as daily oral tablets to be taken twice a day, and will be identical in nature. And so this is a double-blinded study, which means that neither the participants nor the study doctors will know who receives acoramidis or placebo. They'll be identical, and you won't know. Nobody will know which you are assigned to until the end of the study. Participants will be monitored regularly, about every 6 months, through physical exams, imaging tests of the heart, nerve testing, and blood tests. And that will continue until the end of the study. And so how long will the study last? Well, this is an event-driven study. And so that means that the study will complete after a certain number of participants actually develop TTR cardiomyopathy or polyneuropathy during the study itself. And so we don't know how long exactly that will take. It really depends on when participants progress in their disease and actually go on to develop active disease. It could last up to 7 years in order for enough events to happen to assess whether acoramidis prevents or delays disease development. And so that's what it means when it's an event-driven study. Now, for those who do actually develop active disease during the course of the study, if they develop polyneuropathy during the course of the study, they'll then go on to standard of care polyneuropathy treatment outside of the ACT early study. And so that could include one of the gene silencers that is currently approved, most likely in the US. There are additional treatment options outside of the US. And if they're diagnosed with cardiomyopathy during the course of the study, they'll be eligible to receive TTR cardiomyopathy. They'll be eligible to receive acoramidis for treatment as part of an open label extension study through BridgeBio's program. So now, this is a large study. It's going to enroll 582 patients. It's currently recruiting at 84 different centers globally across multiple countries. We've got a number of centers, 37 centers in the US that are currently recruiting. And so we've got these listed here on the slides. And you can find more information. I'll talk later about how to find where these centers are and how to contact them as we get towards the end of the presentation. All right, so now I'm going to move on to two studies for nucresiran, which is a gene silencer. So it's a gene silencer, which means for those of you who are familiar with patisiran or vutrisiran, it's similar in nature, in a little bit different in that it's a subcutaneous injection that only happens twice a year. And so if you've been on patisiran in the past, that's an IV injection every 3 weeks. Vutrisiran or Amvuttra is a quarterly subcutaneous injection. This is one that would actually only happen twice a year. And so this is a study of nucresiran in patients who have wild type or TTR or hereditary TTR cardiomyopathy. And so it's going to evaluate the safety and efficacy of nucresiran in these patients. Efficacy being the ability of a drug to produce a desired effect in expert hands and under ideal circumstances. And so it's typically considered a measure of whether a patient feels better, functions better, or lives longer. Now, this study will evaluate whether nucresiran reduces the risk of death and recurrent cardiovascular events, so cardiovascular hospitalizations and urgent heart failure visits in patients with TTR cardiomyopathy. In order to qualify for this study, patients need to have a medical history of heart failure, so a diagnosis of TTR cardiomyopathy and a history of heart failure. NT-proBNP levels between 300 and 85,000. NT-proBNP is a common cardiac biomarker that is typically going to be measured if you are a patient with TTR cardiomyopathy as part of your routine care. And in order to qualify, you can't have prior experience or current use with any TTR lowering therapies. So namely any of the other gene silencers that are either approved or being investigated for TTR amyloidosis or TTR knockdown agents, including the CRISPR-Cas9 NEX-Z. And so it's looking for patients who haven't received either gene silencers or gene editors. If you're on a stabilizer, that is permitted during the course of the study. So either tafamidis use or acoramidis use, that you can remain on within the study, just can't have prior knockdown or gene silencer use. So nucresiran, as I mentioned, it's administered as a subcutaneous injection every 6 months. So subcutaneous meaning that it's under the skin. It's important to note, again, that not everybody is going to receive nucresiran as part of this study. It is a placebo-controlled study. And so patients are going to be randomly assigned by chance to receive either nucresiran or placebo. Each patient will have a 2 out of 3 or 66% chance of being assigned to NEX-Z, and then a 1 out of 3 or a 33% chance of being assigned to placebo. Now, even if you are assigned to placebo, you can take a stabilizer, as I mentioned, but you would be in the study for the duration, potentially without being on that active treatment arm. And you won't know that until the end of the study, as this is another double-blinded study. So nobody will know who gets nucresiran or placebo until the completion. This is another event-driven study, and so it could take up to 5 years in order for enough events to occur across the entire population of patients. And I've got a website noted there on the slide, so and we'll talk about, again, how to find this trial, the study sites, as well as the other ones later on in the webinar. This is a large study. This is going to enroll 1,250 participants, and is currently recruiting in 12 different locations across the US, South America, Europe, and Asia Pacific. And it will be targeting about 59 centers globally. There are 4 centers currently recruiting in the US. We've got 2 in Georgia, 1 in Boston, 1 in St. Louis, but expect additional US centers to open in Washington, D.C., Florida, Michigan, New York, Pennsylvania, and Texas over the coming months. If this is a study you're interested in, I would suggest contacting your study center, keeping an eye on where these centers are opening. It does take time for centers to open when new studies are getting up and running. And so additional centers will be opening. All right, the next study that I'm going to cover is a phase 3 study for nucresiran, but this is one that's going to be in hereditary TTR patients with polyneuropathy. So the prior study was the TRITON-CM study that's looking at patients who have ATTR cardiomyopathy, either wild type or hereditary. This study is a smaller study focused on patients who have hereditary TTR polyneuropathy. This is going to be a study that looks to determine the efficacy of nucresiran, so that twice-a-year subcutaneous injection, a gene silencer, in patients with hereditary PN by evaluating the effect on neurological impairment, quality of life, nutritional status, disability, and gait speed, so how fast you walk, compared to actually a historical placebo group from a study that was done several years ago. So this study is interesting in that there is no placebo arm. Everybody who participates in this trial will receive access to a therapy. It will either be nucresiran, which is the therapy that's being investigated as part of the study, or actually vutrisiran, which, if you remember a few slides ago, is one of the gene silencers that is currently approved for the treatment of hereditary TTR polyneuropathy. So everybody gets access to some treatment. It's either going to be nucresiran or vutrisiran as part of this study. In order to qualify, patients need to have a diagnosis of TTR polyneuropathy with a documented gene variant. They need to have a neuropathy impairment score of 5 to 150. So this is something that would have to be assessed by a neurologist, by a physician at an amyloid center, and a Karnofsky performance status of greater than 60%. And so this essentially means it has to be somebody who is able to function at a level at least where they might require some occasional assistance, but otherwise are able to care for most of their needs independently. And so this is a smaller study, 125 patients, and participants will have a 4 out of 5 chance, or an 80% chance, of being randomly assigned to either receive nucresiran and getting that injection every 6 months under the skin, or a 1 in 5 chance, 20%, of being assigned to vutrisiran, getting the quarterly injections for 18 months. After 18 months of treatment, everybody will be then eligible to receive nucresiran for up to 18 months moving forward. And so this is a great option, I think, for potential participants in the US, because it's been, as I mentioned, some time since there was a study actively enrolling for hereditary TTR polyneuropathy in the US, which is great. There have been treatments approved, but it's nice to see additional therapeutics coming down the line for that patient population. So the study it's going to enroll 125 participants across the globe. It's currently recruiting. This is a new study that just started. And as I mentioned, it takes time for study centers to get up. We've got one center that's currently open in Boston, but I expect additional centers will be opening up over the coming months. So something to keep an eye on if this is of interest. All right. The last study that I want to highlight as currently recruiting, and this is a new study, which is exciting, is the CLEOPATTRA study. So this is a phase 3 study of Cliramitug, which is an anti-fibril, an anti-amyloid fibril depleter. So this is a drug that is designed to drain the bathtub, remove the amyloid from your organs. This is a phase 3 study looking at Cliramitug in patients who have wild type or hereditary TTR amyloidosis. And so this is a study where we've been waiting for this to come to fruition. If you've been watching these webinars, I've been highlighting the data that will be coming out from the phase 2 study for this for some time. That data was shared at American Heart Association, AHA, in November. And so it was a phase 2 study, but we did see that the treatment with Cliramitug as part of that study did result in a reduction in NT-proBNP compared to placebo in patients who had TTR cardiomyopathy. It was well tolerated, generally it was an acceptable safety profile and generally well tolerated. And there was a number of signals across echocardiography parameters that suggest that Cliramitug could be associated with improvement and cardiac remodeling in patients. And so definitely warrants further study in a phase 3 study. And we're excited to see this. So this is a study that will evaluate whether treatment with Cliramitug can reduce the risk of heart-related death and illness in participants with TTR-CM. It's going to be measured based off of a composite measure of cardiovascular deaths and recurrent cardiovascular events like hospitalizations and urgent heart failure visits. In order to qualify, patients need to have a diagnosis of TTR cardiomyopathy, hereditary or wild type, and there needs to be evidence of cardiac amyloid infiltration, increased left ventricular wall thickness, that's going to be something that's measured on an echo, and chronic heart failure requiring treatment with a loop diuretic. So these would be things to speak to your clinician about whether you would be a good candidate. Additionally, patients need to have elevated levels of NT-proBNP, so at least a minimum of 1,000 picograms per milliliter at screening. And then the current or previous participation in a study for an investigational TTR depleter or TTR gene editing therapy would be exclusionary. And so if you're somebody who has taken part in, for example, the ALXN 2220 study, either currently or previously, and you know you received active treatment, or likewise the NEXT-Z, the NTLA 2001 gene editing studies, you would not be able to participate in this study. But if you're on a gene silencer, that is not exclusionary. If you're on a TTR stabilizer, that is not exclusionary. So you'll be able to continue those and take part in the study. This is another large study, 1,280 patients. Cliramitug is given as an intravenous or infusion, which is, an injection into the vein, if you will, every 4 weeks. And patients will be randomly assigned to receive either Cliramitug or a placebo. And you'll have a 50-50 chance or a 1 in 2 chance of receiving either. And so this is a study that will require you go to a center every 4 weeks, most likely. And so that's something to think about when you're looking at the different study centers. Which ones are you going to be able to make that travel commitment to? And so something to just keep in mind. And again, this is another event-driven study, so it could last potentially up to 4 years for enough events to occur. And I've got the website noted there on the bottom. So this is, again, a new study. It's going to take a while to get all of the study centers up and running, but it will be recruiting across 276 locations across 16 different countries. We currently only have centers that are open in the US, but I expect many more to open within the US and more to open globally over the next few months. So something to keep an eye on. The current centers, the centers that are currently enrolling, we've got ones in Pasadena, Santa Rosa, Farmington Hills in Michigan, and then New York City as well. Or sorry, New York State, I should say. All right, so those are the studies that are currently recruiting. We've got the ATTR, the ATTRACT study looking at gene carriers, the 2 nucresiran studies, one in cardiomyopathy, one in polyneuropathy, and then we have the CLEOPATTRA study looking at the depleter product in TTR cardiomyopathy. And so with that said, there are some additional milestones that are going to be taking place over in the year 2006, so 2026. So these are either data readouts or announcements about currently ongoing studies to keep an eye on. And so I kind of want to focus on these 3 studies that are highlighted here, the eplontersen cardiomyopathy phase 3 study, and then the 2 studies for NEXT-Z, the gene editor, that are on hold. And so we'll start with eplontersen. So the CARDIO-TTRansform study is a phase 3 study of eplontersen, which is a gene silencer. So again, one that is going to turn off the faucet. It's going to inhibit the production of TTR, which will then, prevent TTR amyloid fibrils from forming. This is a phase 3 study that is currently ongoing. This is the largest study that has been conducted in TTR amyloidosis to date. It enrolled over 1,400 patients, which is just remarkable to think about in a rare disease. This is a study that's been going on for a number of years now. Eplontersen is approved currently for the treatment of hereditary TTR with polyneuropathy, but this data will, point to whether the treatment is also effective for TTR cardiomyopathy as well. Eplontersen is given as a subcutaneous injection, so an injection under the skin every 4 weeks. The study has been going on for 140 for individual participants participate for about 140 weeks or over 2.5 years. And so we're expecting the data for this study to read out based off of clinicaltrials.gov in the second half of 2026. And so this will be exciting to see just because it is the biggest trial. It's also exciting to see because it's the largest trial to date. One would be potentially a new treatment option for patients with TTR cardiomyopathy. But then secondarily, because it's the largest study to date, and because of when it enrolled, it's probably got my guess, this is Kristen's guess, nobody else's, probably the largest data set that could potentially provide some evidence to show whether there's a potential benefit to having a silencer like eplontersen plus a stabilizer like tafamidis for patients to be on both. There currently is no real evidence that kind of shows whether there is additional benefit. And so because this study is so large and so many of the patients who enrolled would potentially be on a stabilizer and then receiving the silencer as part of the study, my guess is it's got some good data to point to whether having a silencer plus a stabilizer provides additional benefit over just one or the other. So this will be exciting to see for all of those reasons, new treatment, and then to potentially seeing the combination of both. So the next two studies, I'm not going to talk about these study designs in great detail, but I do want to make sure that everyone is aware, because we've talked about these historically. We've got two studies that are ongoing for and again, I'm not going to try to pronounce it, NextZ and TLA-2001. This is a CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing product. And so these are two studies, one called Magnitude and Magnitude-1, one looking at a phase 3 study of this product in TTR cardiomyopathy, one looking at this product in TTR polyneuropathy. These studies have been ongoing for some time. The cardiomyopathy study is intended to enroll about 1,250 patients. It's my guess, probably about 50% of the way enrolled, and then the polyneuropathy study is a smaller study, 50 patients, that is very close to being fully enrolled. There was a safety event that occurred during the TTR cardiomyopathy study, so this one that I'm showing here, back in October of this year, so where one of the study participants experienced very high liver enzyme levels and elevated bilirubin, and it actually met the study's predefined safety criteria and prompted an FDA clinical hold. And so this is criteria that was written into the study from the very beginning to make sure that they are monitoring the safety of the product and always keeping participant safety at the forefront. And so because that event happened, the study is not dosing additional patients or enrolling additional patients at this time. It's on hold. If a participant has already enrolled in the clinical trial, this is a one-time administration of treatment. And so if you've already enrolled in the study and have already received either NextZ or placebo, you would continue on in this study and have your regular follow-up, but it's not going to be enrolling additional patients, treating new patients until the drug sponsor has partnered and come to an agreement with FDA on how to best mitigate and manage safety moving forward. And so the study's been on hold in October, and so since October, both studies. And so we just need to watch and wait and see what comes out from this. It could be that the study resumes without additional monitoring. It could be that they need to build in additional procedures or different eligibility criteria to make sure that they are including a slightly more controlled group of participants, but we just don't know yet. And so something to keep an eye on if you're interested in the gene editors as a knockdown therapy, that we should be hopefully hearing more about if and when this studies resume over the next few months. So, and again, I've got the slide on the cardiomyopathy study and then the slide on the polyneuropathy study. And so those will be available. So one thing before we end, I just wanted to highlight is how long does it take to get FDA approval after a phase 3? We talked about how the eplontersen study, we're expecting it will, read out sometime this year. And then I know patients historically have really had an eye on depleters, and the Alexion 2220 is one that has come up historically. As we know that data will be coming out in 2027, but what does that mean in terms of when it gets approved? The study's enrolled, so when's the drug going to get approved? And so I put down some timelines here. These are Kristen's like back of the envelope calculations. I have absolutely no insight into exactly what timelines different companies are working with. It really depends. Each group has their own processes that they follow, and different timeframes. So this is what my back of the envelope calculations, and nobody should take anything more than that from it. But having worked on trials before, my goal was always roughly from the point that the last piece of data was collected within a study, that you would want to have all the cleaning and the results available around 3 months from that last point. It then takes a tremendous amount of work within pharmaceutical companies, biotech companies, to actually build the submission package that gets sent to FDA. So that process can take around 6 months itself, just putting together all of the right, putting the data in the right format, all the documentation that FDA and other regulators will need. That can take about 6 months to do. FDA then has a 60-day time frame, 2 months, where they can check to make sure that the submission is complete, ask questions, point out where it might not be if it isn't. And then from that point, depending on whether a company has priority review designation or not, it can take as little as 6 months for FDA to complete their review, or up to 10 months. And if at any point during those timeframes there are questions that FDA has to go back and ask the drug companies, that can stop the clock, and they need to wait for a response until it starts again. So again, my back of the envelope calculations. Eplontersen, we talked about earlier. On clinicaltrials.gov, you can see that they're projecting that study will complete in April of 2026. So just using my calculations, just trying to project forward what this might look like if the study completes in April of 2026. That last piece of data is collected then. If could potentially think about results in July of 2026, a submission to FDA in January of 2027, and then potentially approval sometimes towards the end of 2027, early 2028, depending on how it's reviewed within FDA. Likewise, Alexion 2220, the Alexion depleter product. We know that so clinicaltrials.gov projects that study will complete in June of 2027. Using these same calculations, you could potentially see the drug getting approved. Assuming the data is positive, I should say, for both of these, assuming the data is positive, could potentially be looking at approvals late 2028 to early 2029. So something that's just helpful, because I know people always, that's one of the questions we get a lot, is once a study enrolls, when's it going to be approved, and once it reads out, when it's going to be approved. So that was a lot to go through in a really short amount of time. It also only represents a fraction of the number of trials that are currently recruiting. There are a number of different imaging studies, observational studies, single center studies, registries that are currently ongoing. I've listed some of them here. These are studies that are recruiting that you can find more information about on clinicaltrials.gov, through my amyloidosis pathfinder, which I'll talk about in a minute, or in some cases study websites themselves. And so I won't cover them now, but do want to highlight that these are some of the additional studies that are going on that don't involve investigational therapeutics, novel therapeutics for TTR amyloidosis. And so lastly, I just want to close with how to find clinical trials. If you're somebody who's interested in participating, you want to know if you're a good candidate, you want to try to recruit, enroll in some of these. There are a few different ways that you can find trials and stay informed. One is clinicaltrials.gov. It's a publicly available and federally mandated national database of clinical trials in the US. Outside of the US, many trials are still listed there, though it is publicly available and mandated just for the United States, to studies that have centers in the United States. I will say I've been working in clinicaltrials.gov for over 20 years now. It's not the easiest database to navigate through, and so we've tried to list some other ways to search for trials here. You can always talk to your healthcare provider. Let them know you're interested, you want to know how to participate in trials, if you might be a good candidate. Letting them know is often the first step to helping them help you connect with centers if they are not themselves a center that participated in studies. You can follow patient organizations like ARC or amyloidosis support groups here in the US. Amyloidosis Alliance is a great one to connect with outside of the US. And then lastly, because I mentioned clinicaltrials.gov is not the easiest database to search through. We developed an online tool called My Amyloidosis Pathfinder, or MAP, to help patients with amyloidosis get connected to clinical trials specific to their type of amyloidosis and symptoms, and then also to get connected with treatment centers as well. So you can use it even if you don't want to find a trial. It can help you find treatment centers that might be appropriate for you. You can access MAP by going to myamyloidosispathfinder.com. We'll provide the link and some materials after this. Anybody can create a profile in My Amyloidosis Pathfinder, patients, caregivers. If you think you might be a patient, but you're not actually sure, you think you have amyloid, but you're not sure, anybody can create a profile. You'll be asked to sign up as a new user and then answer a few short questions about whether you have been diagnosed, if you have, what organs are involved, what type you have, what kind of symptoms you might have, what treatments you have experienced with. And then once your profile is completed, you'll be able to find and compare amyloidosis centers that suit your amyloidosis treatment centers that suit your needs, as well as get matched to clinical trials that you might qualify for based off of your amyloidosis profile. So when you complete the profile, you'll see instantly which trials are currently on there that you might be matched to. And then as new trials are added, and our team is doing this on an ongoing basis, adding new trials and new treatment centers, you'll receive notifications letting you know, hey, there's a new trial that's opened up. You might actually be a good candidate. Here's where you can find more information. So this is MAP. Yeah, I would encourage you, if you're interested, to sign up. If you ever have any questions, please reach out to the team here at ARC, and we're happy to help you. So it's a great way to stay informed of and get involved with trials, which ultimately helps advance research towards better treatments and hopefully someday a cure for amyloidosis. So thank you, everybody. Please don't forget to do the post-meeting survey. It really does helpful. It really is helpful if you want more information about specific topics, if you want different topics shared, right level information, wrong level of information. Any feedback is always helpful. So very much appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Kristen. That was amazing. As always, so informative. Every time I hear it, I learn something. And just with the questionnaires, as you fill that survey out afterwards, if there are any topics that you would like us to do an ARC Talks on, please share those. All right, this is going to be like speed dating. We have a lot of questions, so I'm going to start throwing some at you. I think it'd be really helpful, Kristen, if you can just give a little bit of an explanation on the difference between knockdown and stabilizer.
Yeah. So a TTR. So if we think back to that analogy, actually, let me pull up a slide. So a TTR knockdown agent is going to be one that actually prevents your body from creating the TTR protein. And so I'm going to pull up, sorry, just give me a second, this slide here. Actually, I'm going to have to put this back in presentation mode. Sorry, this is where I don't do a good job of multitasking. Okay, so let's... You seen the slides?
Yep.
Okay, sorry.
Okay. At the moment.
Yeah, so let me, okay.
Good.
Okay, so a TTR knockdown agent, what that's going to do is actually stop your body from forming this TTR protein. We all form TTR. It's created by the liver. A TTR knockdown agent would either be like a gene silencer or a CRISPR-Cas9 gene editor that stops your body from producing TTR altogether. If you're not producing TTR, it can't dissociate and then form amyloid fibrils. And so it's going to turn off the faucet. A TTR depleter is one that is actually going to drain the tub of existing amyloid fibrils. And so your body's still going to keep producing the TTR protein, but what a depleter is going to do is actually, as your body is forming these amyloid fibrils that are building up in your organs, a TTR depleter is actually going to remove them from your organs so that they're not causing that dysfunction. And so if you think back to our bathtub analogy, sorry. The knockdown agents are going to be the ones that turn off the faucet here, and then the depleters are going to be the ones that are actually drain the tub. Stabilizers are a type of or stabilizers are a product that are going to actually keep the TTR from separating in these. So remember, TTR is a tetramer. It's got these 4 different subunits that naturally stick together nicely. In TTR amyloidosis, the tetramers separate into and dissociate into these 4 different subunits, which then misfold into and aggregate and misfold into amyloid fibrils. So a TTR stabilizer is going to stop it from actually dissociating. It's going to keep it in its native form. So knockdown agents stop you from producing TTR. Stabilizers stop the TTR from dissociating and forming fibrils, and then depleters stop the fibrils from, or they don't stop the fibrils from forming in the organs. They might, but essentially they remove them from the organs.
Excellent. Thank you. That's a great answer, Kristen. So moving on, are there any, there have been a couple of questions around silencers and stabilizers. Are there any studies that show that they're beneficial in combination, or any studies that show one versus the other?
Yeah. So the short answer is no, not yet. And so there have been, for like some of the studies that have read out recently, there are some small groups of patients that have received both a stabilizer and a silencer, but really in small numbers and not enough to show really a statistically significant difference as to whether treatment with both a stabilizer and a silencer offers any benefit over one or the other. Similarly, there haven't been any head-to-head studies that have compared, a stabilizer to a silencer to know whether one type is better than the other. You can't try to look at the results across studies and make assumptions just because they all enroll slightly different patient populations. They look at slightly different endpoints. They're doing the analyses in different ways. And so the short answer is unfortunately no. With that said, I mentioned the CARDIO-TTRansform study is going to read out in 2026, and that's by far about the largest study to date in TTR cardiomyopathy, and it included, I would expect, a very healthy number of patients who were received both that were taking stabilizers, primarily tafamidis, and would be randomized to receive either eplontersen or placebo. And so that will be the first, I think, sizable data set that could potentially offer evidence to show whether use with both in combination offers benefit over one or the other. But it will take some time to go through that data. Again, that's my guess that's kind of going to be the first data that we would see that would answer the question. But the short answer right now is no, there isn't. Though we know there's a lot of interest in whether both offer benefit and if one is better than the other.
Excellent. Thank you. So we've had a couple of questions about the Attralus AT-02. Are you able to share any information about what's happening with that?
Yeah, so Attralus did a study of AT-02, which is actually designed as a pan-amyloid depleter, so something that was intended to be used across different types of amyloidosis, AL, TTR, some other types, to see whether it was effective at removing amyloid and improving patients' outcomes. Unfortunately, they did not see there was no data to show that treatment with AT-02 was effective in patients who had TTR amyloidosis. And so that product is no longer being evaluated or developed for TTR amyloidosis, to my knowledge. With that said, they did see an effect in patients who have AL amyloidosis with renal involvement. So there is a study that is continuing where they are evaluating it in patients who have AL amyloidosis with renal involvement. But unfortunately, there was no benefit seen in patients with TTR.
Okay, that's great to know about and have an update on. And we've had the one other study, actually there were a couple of studies people asked specifically. I know we're almost at time, but maybe we can run just a few minutes over. I don't think we'll be able to get to all the questions, but I think there are ones that would be really helpful. With the DepleTTR-CM study, also the ALXN2220, could you just give a little information? I know you were focused particularly on studies that were enrolling, but there were some questions about that study. Just an update on it.
Yeah, so the Alexion 2220 study. So Alexion 2220, which is, I'm going to pull this slide back up, has been renamed very similarly to Cliramitug. So let me pull this back up. Okay, so Alexion 2220, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is an anti-fibril agent. So this is a product, it was originally called NI-006. I went through a phase 1 study with a company called Neurimmune in Europe several years ago. It's now a study that's being developed, or a product that's being developed in partnership with Alexion. They're leading the development of it. It's called Cliramitug. Very similar to Kramituk, but Cliramitug. And it has a phase 3 study that is currently ongoing called the depleter trial. And so I don't have a slide for it just because it's not recruiting at the moment, but it is a large phase 3 study of Cliramitug in patients with TTR cardiomyopathy. It is fully enrolled. It enrolled very quickly. And so it's one where, if I advance to the next slide, you can see we're actually expecting the results for this in 2027. And so there's not the opportunity to participate in this study currently, but we are hoping to get, or additional options to participate in the study. We are hoping to see data from this sometime in 2027. And then potentially, assuming that the data is positive, in late 2028 to like early 2029 timeframe. So, but this would be a depleter. So again, similar to Cliramitug, and then it's designed to drain the bathtub, remove the existing amyloid. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, that's a great answer. We've had a few questions which are about whether these things will be excluded or whether they'll be studied or included in clinical trials. One of which is, will having an ICD implanted, which is a cardiac defibrilator, preclude me from participation in an interventional clinical trial?
Yeah, so that I can't answer, or I don't want to give the wrong answer. There can not uncommonly be 40 different specific inclusion-exclusion criteria for any one of these studies. So I'd want to take a look at the study itself. I can, after this, maybe follow up with that patient and see what I can find, but I don't want to say the wrong thing. And yeah.
Great, that would be helpful. There are a few studies that require elevated NT-proBNP level. If a person's level is normal, but imaging of evidence of cardiac infiltration is seen, it appears that, but if you're not including those patients, that it will delay opportunities for early treatment. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, it's a really hard one. And so unfortunately, most of the trials in TTR cardiomyopathy that are recruiting today are looking for elevated levels of NT-proBNP. And so when you're designing a trial, you want to design the drug in a population that's going to give you the highest chance of being successful so that you get the product approved and in the hands of as many patients as possible who might benefit from it. That unfortunately, in some cases, and where we are right now, requires that it being studied in patients who do have those higher levels of NT-proBNP and more advanced cardiac involvement. And so, but we know there are patients who continue to not feel well, but might not have higher levels of NT-proBNP to qualify. My advice in that case would be NT-proBNP is very variable. You can walk into a visit one day, and then depending on, your level of hydration, what food you ate, like you can have a different level of NT-proBNP the next day. So this is something to discuss with your physician. I would encourage you to reach out to a center, let them know what your historical levels have been, and see if they think you would be potentially a good candidate to participate. As an organization, we're doing everything we can to encourage drug developers to design and implement studies in TTR for patients with TTR amyloidosis who are symptomatic but might not have those high levels of NT-proBNP that are being studied in the phase 3 studies. So I'm hopeful that we'll be able to share that that's something that the field is moving forward to in the coming year. But right now, that's something that we're working to really push and address, because we know there are many patients who would benefit, are interested in taking part in these studies, but just don't meet that single eligibility criteria, which is important for good reason. So
yeah. And Along that line, there are a number of patients, or participants, I should say, who have asked whether if you have ATTR wild type, but in other organs, so not in the heart. So if you have nerve involvement, GI or muscle or musculoskeletal, are there any clinical trials that are open or would for those patients?
Yeah, so I don't know that there are any investigative trials looking at, or investigative treatment trials. So there are definitely a number of studies that are looking to better describe the natural history of having wild type TTR amyloidosis outside of the heart. We're very early in the infancy of our understanding of wild type TTR amyloidosis, and in that regards, we really don't understand the natural history well to know what that extra cardiac involvement looks like. And so that's why we don't see clinical trials currently being designed to test the efficacy of these drugs in non-cardiac wild-type TTR amyloidosis. We have to learn about what the natural history is first, how that would typically progress to know how to design a study to see if a treatment would be effective. And so there are definitely some screening studies and natural history studies, but right now I don't think there are any studies looking at the effectiveness of these treatments in non-cardiac TTR amyloid. I will say we've developed a patient-reported outcome tool. ARC has developed the ATTR-QOL, the Transthyretin Amyloidosis Quality of Life Questionnaire, which is a mouthful, the ATTR-QOL, that is really designed to capture this full range of symptoms that all patients with TTR amyloidosis, either neuropathy or cardiomyopathy or GI musculoskeletal, are experiencing, so that those can be better understood and studied and approached with therapy. And so it's definitely something that we still need to learn more about, and we're pushing companies to and researchers to really to better understand what that looks like, so that we can move to a space where we're testing therapies in those patient populations.
And I would put a plug in that it is vital to participate, if you can, in observational studies like this to help us grow our understanding so that we can do these trials. There are quite a lot more questions. What we will do is, we are definitely over time. We will respond to these questions by email. If you feel you had a question that didn't get answered, please write to us, email us, or call us. The email is support@archi.org. And with that, I'd love to thank you enormously, Kristen, for a wonderful presentation. Great questions. So thank you to the audience for attending, and have a good day. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.